Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the webinar on financing metropolitan governments in developing countries. My name is Katrin Farvag-Vitkovic. I'm a lead urban development specialist at the World Bank. Today we have a very exciting program. This is actually the 14th webinar in the series of webinars based on the book edited by Rory Ball, Johannes Lin and Debbie Wetzel called Financing Metropolitan Governance in Developing Countries. Today's seminar will be presented by Johannes Lin and will be structured as follows. Johannes will give two presentations this morning. One first presentation on external assistance for metropolitan development, 20-minute presentation. The second presentation, shorter presentation, about 10-minute presentation, will be summing up this 14 webinar series on financing metropolitan governance. So let me first say a few words on Johannes Lin. I don't think it's actually necessary to introduce him, but Johannes is currently a resident senior scholar at the Emerging Markets Forum in Washington, D.C. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institutions. From 2005 to 2010, he was director of the Wolfensohn Center for Development at Brookings. Prior to joining Brookings in 2003, he worked for 3 decades at the World Bank in various capacities, including at the bank vice president for financial policy and resource mobilization, and as vice president for Europe and Central Asia. Johannes has published extensively on development and global governance issues, including urban public finance in developing countries and financing metropolitan governments in developing countries, a book published by the Lincoln Institute in 2013, and as I mentioned previously, co-edited with Rory Ball and Debbie Wetzel. His current research interests and recent publications are in the areas of aid effectiveness, with a special focus on scaling up successful development interventions, and on global governance reform, as well as on regional cooperation, with a special regional focus on Central Asia. Johannes holds a bachelor degree from Oxford University, as well as a doctorate in economics from Cornell University. So without any further ado, let me give the floor to Johannes for a first presentation. External assistance for metropolitan development. After this first presentation, a second one will sum up the summaries of the 14 webinars on the topic, and we will then open the floor half an hour for discussions and questions. Thank you very much. Johannes, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Katrin, and good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's great to have you here. I also want to thank especially the World Bank Institute and the Lincoln Institute for making this webinar series possible for us as the co-editors and the authors of this volume. We were just extraordinarily pleased and happy that a webinar series could be organized. There's really nothing quite like it. I should also say this is the first time that I'm involved in a webinar, so if I screw up, please forgive me, and we'll make it work. So thanks very much for being on board today. So the first presentation is actually about the last chapter of the book, and the title of the chapter is External Assistance for Metropolitan Development. Let me get right into it because our time is limited and I usually run out of time, so let me try and do this as efficiently as possible. By way of background, I'm sure by now, having listened to 13 or watched 13 webinars, you are well aware, if you're not in any case aware, that there are great urban financing needs for infrastructure and slum improvement. This actually was recognized in the Millennium Development Goal number 7 with a target 11 that aimed at removing at least 100 million slum dwellers out of slum conditions. And of course, we all would agree, I think, that trying to support urban and metropolitan development in developing countries is an appropriate focus for external assistance. What, in principle, should external assistance try and do? Well, it should help finance infrastructure and shelter investments, obviously, but also we believe, and that's relevant especially for this book and for our work here, support the development of urban management and finance capacity. And so in the last chapter, Homi Karas and I, Homi was my co-author, also from Brookings, Homi Karas and I addressed 4 questions. First of all, how much urban aid is there relative to an estimate of needs? Secondly, what strategies are there for urban aid? And third, what experience do we actually have with urban aid in terms of impact and results? And finally, are there any lessons we should share with aid agencies and aid recipients for improved urban aid? So let me run through these questions as quickly as I can. First of all, how much urban aid is there? Well, let's start before we go into how much aid. Do we have a sense of what are the needs for urban aid? Well, this is a very confusing picture, as you will have noticed if you read the chapter already, but let me just summarize. There is an estimate that achieving MDG 7 Target 11 regarding slums will cost at least $5 billion per annum. On the other hand, there are also estimates that are aggregated up from some regional estimates that Asian Development Bank did on urban infrastructure needs, which would fall in the range of about $120 billion per year. The bottom line is we don't have a good idea, but the financing needs are likely to be in the hundreds of billions. Now, not all of this necessarily, of course, has to be financed by aid. There's, of course, local financing, and we'll talk quite a bit about this, but nonetheless, this gives us an order of magnitude of what the financing needs are. Now, do we know how much aid actually flows into urban and metropolitan areas? And here it's actually quite surprising. When you look at the data, you find the aid data that are collected particularly by OECD DAC, you find that the data is actually not very clear. There's some tagging, as they call, of project finances that go to urban areas, but it's very incomplete by all accounts. And by the way, we don't have any information on what aid goes specifically for urban finance improvements, which we are interested in this book. And of course, there's no good metrics of impact. Unfortunately, we don't really know how much improvements as a result of this, and this, I think, we believe, undermines to some extent the willingness of donors to support urban development, in contrast to, say, HIV/AIDS or other interventions where it's very clear what kind of impact you have. Now, in terms of the guesstimates of aid flows that we've come up with, those aid flows that are actually tagged as going to urban areas are in the order of $2 billion plus in 2008. That was the last data we had available when we wrote the paper. However, we also looked actually specifically at project descriptions and looked at which, from the descriptions, not from the tagging, but from descriptions, what projects seem to be specifically focused on urban. And then we come up with a much larger number, namely 12.5 billion, which is about 7% of total concessional and non-concessional aid. Here are some graphs which you'll also find in the book, which show trends over time. In the the red line shows on the left-hand side the absolute amounts. The right-hand side shows the shares of total aid flows. Of the red line is the explicit, what we call explicitly tagged urban aid. The yellow line is what we estimate from our special investigation, and the blue line is the totals. And what you see is that in absolute terms it's been going up and down, but roughly constant. In relative terms as a share, it's actually, if anything, been going down somewhat over the last 10, 15 years or so. Now, who is helping? We came up with about 42 donors that have provided more than $100 million total since 1995, which is, by the way, less fragmentation in the sector than we see in many other sectors, for example, in education and health. Actually, 4 donors account for almost 60% of total aid. But there's still a lot of challenges of partnership and coordination, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Among the top donors, you'll see in this graph at the bottom, if you go from the right to left, the largest 8 donors are all multilateral institutions except for Japan, and the World Bank Group is by far the largest. If you look at IBRD on the far right, and then the fourth in from the right is IDA, and you combine those two, you actually get that IBRD and IDA combined are 5 times the next largest donor, which is IADB, the Inter-American Development Bank, followed by Asian Development Bank and EBRD and so on. Well, Japan is actually the second largest, I should have mentioned that. Who is actually receiving? This is quite interesting. Most of the aid actually, as you again look from right to left on the blue chart, goes to the BRICS or middle income countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Mexico is also in there. The middle income countries combined get a very large fraction, and we find that Africa actually gets very little. So this is the overall picture, and what we come up with, let me just summarize here before we go to the next question, is that a bottom line is that really the needs are likely to be much larger than what's being provided. The trends have been, if anything, in terms of shares of aid down, and there are relatively few large donors in this business, and in particular we find that the data are very weak, and one of the recommendations is that data should actually be improved so we know better, both on the needs side and on the aid supply side, what is going on. Now let us turn to the second question, and this is the second question is, what do donors actually try to do? What do they see as the problems, and what is their proposed response? So reviewed a number of official aid agencies, aid strategies and approaches, and you see on this slide the agencies that for whom we did find specific urban strategies. And when you review this, the interesting thing is that they actually all agree pretty much that they are great urban finance needs, that there's weak local government capacity, that there's accountability issues and weak resources, and that is a need for aid, and indeed more aid in future, to focus on this set of issues. Now, if you look at more specifically what donors say are the problems and what they want to do about it, in terms of own revenues by metropolitan urban governments, they find that there's insufficient local revenue authority and effort and lack of incentives to raise revenues, and they propose in their assistance to help with cadastral service, with revenue collection, and with financial management. On transfers, they analyze the current situation as unpredictable transfers, non-transparent transfers, poor incentives in terms of transfers, and they propose to help to reverse these features. In terms of accessing private capital, they think there's scope for increasing access to capital markets, especially in middle-income countries, and they propose to support private-public partnerships. On financial management and planning, they see this as a critical challenge and want to help in this area, especially by improving accountability in terms of improved financial management and planning. And finally, on partnerships and donor coordination, they do believe that local partnerships are important, but interesting enough, they actually don't talk much about coordination among themselves, with the exception of the African Development Bank as they set out their strategy. Finally, in terms of sort of scaling up impact, they do recognize that their project-by-project intervention and the scattered approach of the past is a problem, and that there's a need for long-term engagement, for roadmaps, and a programmatic approach in the way they proceed. Now, question number 3, what has been the experience with urban aid? Here we looked at evaluations of urban aid for 3 agencies where we found useful evaluations. Let me not go into the strengths of looking at the evaluations limitations here. You can see them both on the slide, but also in the book if you're interested. We actually found that these evaluations and reviews of urban aid were very helpful and a useful way to analyze the actual experience. Now, if we first look at what do we know about how urban projects perform, we actually found, and this is, I feel, quite interesting and important, is that urban development projects, on balance, are satisfactory and successful in proportions similar or better than projects in other sectors. So that's, in a sense, is no excuse for donors if they don't pay a lot of attention to urban. There's no excuse by saying, well, these projects aren't doing well enough, we've got to be busy elsewhere. In fact, that's not the case. If anything, projects in the urban sector are doing better. Same is actually true for African project performance. African projects in the municipal development area actually above worldwide performance. So there's really no good excuse for not doing more in Africa. Let me run on and say very briefly the big problem is sustainability of urban projects. They have generally been ranked low on that score, and the principal reason is that there's lack of adequate financial resources for operations and maintenance, and in particular a lack of sustained improvement in the own resource raising capacity of municipalities. And that's obviously directly leads into the issue of urban finance and urban finance improvements. So as we then look at what the strategies have said in terms of problem areas that governments want to be busy in, and what they've actually done, we find, and this is then of course important for the recommendations at the end of the chapter, a great disconnect between the strategies and actual implementation in aid. So first point is that donors say we want to do more in urban development, in supporting urban development. Well, as we've seen, there's actually stagnant engagement and, if anything, a reduced focus and capacity at least through 2008 and maybe beyond that. Secondly, donors would like to see improved urban finance mobilization and management critical for the effective development of cities, but in fact, if you look at the projects, there's relatively little to the attention to these aspects in the design and implementation and in evaluation of urban development projects. Third, they say we want to empower local authorities to raise their own revenues so you can meet their expenditure responsibilities. However, in practice, the ability and willingness of municipal governments has been weak, and donor support for targeted improvements in local revenue capacity has been quite limited, or at least has had limited impact. They then talk about transfers. They want to see predictable, transparent transfers with incentives, performance-based incentives. And indeed, here we find there's some good examples, especially for the World Bank. But very often, intergovernmental transfers are actually outside the donor-supported urban development projects. And so the whole transfer-based issues are not addressed. There is an interest in the strategies of developing municipal borrowing practices. In fact, however, few donor-supported initiatives can be found in these areas, although some of them have been successful. And finally, we see increased reliance as I noted, donors would like to see increased reliance on private sector engagement, but in fact, they have provided limited support and generally with mixed success. I have a few more points on disconnect on urban management and planning. This is seen to be as important in the strategies, but actually we find very little information about what has been done. On partnership development, we find that in general there's been limited focus on partnership and coordination among donors. And finally, when it comes to going beyond one-off projects and taking longer-term programmatic and sequenced approach, we find that the World Bank and Asian Development Bank actually have been involved in sequential projects in given countries. But in fact, because there's very weak monitoring evaluation and limited learning from what we can see in these sequential projects, and there's no systematic approach of replication and scaling up, we believe this is a weakness that needs to be addressed. So we come now to fourth and last question for this particular part of my presentation. So what are the lessons for urban aid? A few lessons that build directly on the disconnects that we've identified. First of all, we believe that the urban aid should focus much more explicitly on urban finance issues as a key element of supporting sustainability of the donor finance programs. Secondly, it's really important to realistically assess a government's plans for decentralization. We found that when the World Bank in particular has provided a lot of assistance in this area, has not been effectively analyzing the government's interest in this area. Very often decentralization plans have not been effective. A third point is that there really needs to be a realistic, comprehensive fiscal plan as a condition for receipt of urban development funds. We need results metrics. In other words, we need to know what kind of financial outcomes we're looking for, and we need to carefully track those with effective monitoring evaluation. And when it comes to grants, they should be performance linked. whether donor financed or not, in order to ensure municipal accountability. But in order to actually effectively implement that, discipline has to be asserted so that the grant-making authority actually live up to the conditions that they want to see followed. I believe this is the last slide for this particular presentation. We have 5 more lessons. Creditworthiness is an important, and market access is an important point to focus on, because over the long term we believe there is scope for market access and borrowing by municipal governments and metropolitan governments, especially in the middle income countries. However, and this is a point, actually the 4th point down here, it's very important that the foreign exchange risk has to be carefully assessed and is either hedged or removed from municipal responsibilities, because municipalities and metropolitan governments do not have the capacity to effectively manage foreign exchange risk. Going back up to the 2nd point, we have clear need for adequate technical support for capacity building. Training, which is very often provided by donors, is not enough. There has to be much more done to set up actually capacity building capacity within the countries, and here metropolitan development funds have been a good solution in some countries to support systematic capacity building in the metropolitan and urban areas. Obviously, and it seems that it goes without saying almost, there needs to be coordination and indeed where possible pooling of multiple donors' resources. And finally, we believe donors need to plan for long-term engagement or systematic handoff in their projects, so you don't have these one-off projects that make a little splash, but then after a few years you see very little long-term impact. A focus on scaling up is absolutely essential. So we have with this the first more or less 20 minutes. I hope I kept about to my time limit. I will now switch to the second part of my presentation, which is a summing up of the overall series, and in effect sort of trying to share with you my own personal views and perceptions on what I take away from the book as a whole. Now, this is quite personal, and you may, after reading the book, find that you have quite different views. So let me quickly run you through in about 10 minutes through what I see as some of my takeaways from the overall effort that you see reflected in the book. Let me quickly grab a drink of water here. So let's start with this first slide. As I looked at the overall book, and I read the various chapters, reread them many times, as you might imagine as an editor, I sort of imagined, so what we all think in 2050, let's say, or whatever is the time horizon we have in mind, what might be an ideal metropolitan urban management and finance situation that we collectively would regard as appropriate for cities in developing countries, or even cities around the world, metropolitan areas around the world. So the first point that I would make here, and this is the first chapter by Shahid Yusuf, makes that point, of course, that metropolitan areas are the drivers of innovation, of modernization and growth, and in order to serve this function, they need effective management and finance. Now, that implies a number of important points about their characteristics. We need a decentralized, metropolitan-wide government by 2050 in the cities of the developing and global world even, where these metro governments have control over function, finance, and their functionaries in a way that aligns autonomy, accountability, and capacity. And if you've read particularly the chapter by Sudan Ilmas, you will recognize the terminology that's used here, but it also underlies the chapters by Roy Ball and Smoke on metropolitan governance. The third point, how would overall the metros be financed? Well, they'd be largely self-financed, relying on a combination of well-designed and well-administered property taxes, on certain non-property taxes, user charges, and collectively these revenues would serve for urban citizens to pay for the costs that the city incurs on their behalf. This is reflected in Burden Slack's chapter, in Martin Vasquez's chapter, and so on. When you then come to the financing of large infrastructure investments, here I think the authors would agree, borrowing or public-private partnerships are in principle the right way to go. Transfers should be limited, and where they take place, they should be performance-based, competitive, and asymmetrical, meaning more likely more transfers in the smaller towns and for rural areas and less for the metropolitan areas. This would be found in Anwar Shah's chapter. And finally, of course, as we just heard, Karas and Lin would argue that external assistance needs to be more systematically and effectively focused on supporting urban and including metropolitan finance. So this is the overall sort of ideal picture where I believe, looking at the chapters, where one would want to end up. What is today's reality? Well, as we noted early on, there's a huge gap between investment needs and resources, as far as we can tell. Of course, the data are really bad. There's a huge gap between theory and practice. In other words, what we theoreticians or academics or more sort of policy analysts say and what's actually happening in practice is quite far apart. Practices differ widely across countries and cities. Many cities depend on a mix of transfers and inefficient or ineffective local revenue sources with limited use of user charges, property taxes, and land value capture, and limited borrowing and limited public-private partnerships. That is due in part, but only in part, to limited local revenue authority. In fact, however, the available revenue capacity of metropolitan areas is often underutilized. So, what's the answer? Well, I think if you read the book and have listened to the previous webinars, you will find that there's no blueprint, no silver bullet, but I think we've come up with a menu of options for a combination of own resources and external resources. And let me briefly run you, just to remind you and to sum up, or run you through the menu. So own resources on the left-hand side, external resources on the right-hand side. Very briefly, what are the main conclusions? I think we need to change, sorry for that, we need to change the slide. So let's start first of all, own resources, user charges. Well, these are best, if you remember the relevant chapters, for utilities, transport, and such areas as waste collection. In theory, they have great efficiency, revenue and equity properties. In practice, however, they're not widely and not effectively used, and indeed, some of our experts in this book tend to discount user charges. I personally feel that's a mistake. I believe from my work over many years that actually user charges are a very important source, and we need to keep at it. In other words, use them and develop them and strengthen them wherever possible. Property taxes. In principle, a great source of urban and metropolitan finance. In practice, as you will recall from the relevant chapter by McCluskey and Franson, relatively little used, difficult to administer, politically unattractive. There is an increased reliance on capital value approaches and on modern cadastral methods. But again, the experts in our book and more generally don't necessarily regard property taxes as very promising. However, I believe, and actually McCluskey and Franson would be among those who would also argue, let's keep at it. It is in principle a good revenue source, and we should really pursue it, and metropolitan governments should pursue it as far as possible. Now, a third source of revenues, metropolitan revenues, that's actually maybe not as much analyzed in the book as in reflection I would like to see. And at the bottom of the slide, you see a reference to a very nice paper by Martin Smolker, Implementing Value Capture in Latin America by the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. On reflection, I think this is an area where actually more needs to be done. The idea is that we capture land value increment of public infrastructure investments. There are many interesting examples around the globe, called sometimes special assessments, sometimes valorization. In Colombia, if you're from Colombia, you know that well. Land readjustment, if you're from Korea, you might know that. And of course, China has used the sale of rural land extensively, as you will have seen in the China chapter by Ms. Wong. However, they're rarely used systematically or applied for the long haul. And actually, turns out it's a bit difficult to transfer them from one context to another because they're administratively tricky, can be politically unattractive, and legally ambiguous. However, again, I think it's important to pursue this source of revenue, particularly for major infrastructure, creating land access and value. For example, metros in Delhi. Delhi should have financed a significant part of its metro investment, the subway investment, through land value capture. Unfortunately, it did not. Among own resources, finally, we have other taxes. Here, of course, the general advice in the papers, in the chapters, is go for the good ones, especially income tax, which could be shared, for motor vehicle taxes, which I personally am a great supporter of. Unfortunately, however, national governments tend to be jealous in not sharing these revenues, and moreover, metropolitan fragmentation can limit the scope for use of these good local revenues. Then there's sort of the old standbys, local business and sales taxes. In general, they can be okay, but they have to be carefully designed, as the chapters would point out. Then there are a bunch of bad local taxes, the octroi in Mumbai, you may be familiar with, and a bunch of nuisance taxes that should be limited rather than being relied on as they today are. Let's then turn very briefly to external resources. Transfers, the chapter by Shah would argue that in principle, transfers and grants are a good idea for dealing with spillovers, for equalization, for large infrastructure investments, and for fragmented metropolitan government. The practice we find is all over the place and often not very positive. From our perspective, the bottom line is one should go for good design, asymmetrical, meaning less transfers from metropolitan areas, incentive-based, linked to capacity building, and perhaps administered by metropolitan development funds that have been successfully operated in some countries. Borrowing is best, as we point out, for financing larger capital investments with a long life, but here, of course, lack of creditworthiness at the metropolitan level, irresponsible borrowing practice, and lack of project preparation capacity may limit. However, we've seen that in industrial countries, borrowing is used widely for urban development and metropolitan areas, and some interesting cases can be found in Colombia and Korea and in India. So, if you go for borrowing, you need strong regulatory oversight, a municipal rating system, strengthening of local revenue and management capacity, and of course, as I mentioned earlier, you need to avoid or hedge exchange risk. The last but one, I believe, is among external resources is public-private partnerships. They were the big hope for urban infrastructure in the 1990s, but in practice are not a silver bullet. They're most used for power and transport infrastructure, less so for water and sanitation. And the challenge for urban metropolitan governments is that they lack the experience and capacity, that there are sometimes political challenges to effectively deploying these PPPs, and of course the supply of money may dry up when there are global recessions and financing dries up for developing countries as a whole, as was the case in 2008-2009. Here it's important for the long term to build capacity and explore windows of opportunity, but one should probably not be overly optimistic. Finally, and I will not repeat what I said in the first part of my presentation, there are of course external aid, resources. The good news is that donors have good intentions and strategies. The bad news in a way is that there's a great gap between intention and delivery, and so we think donors have to learn a few lessons. Now, the way forward, in our view, collectively as I look at the book, is you need to keep at it. Don't give up. Do good pragmatic analysis and give good pragmatic advice on the ground. Share the experience across countries. Build capacity and stay engaged for sustained implementation. Second, focus on the financial capacity of metropolitan areas. Very important if you want to see long-term metropolitan, effective long-term development in the context of a good understanding of your national and local institutions and politics, while looking for opportunities to change whatever currently are the problems. Third, push for self-financing metropolitan areas using user charges, property tax, and motor vehicle taxes, ideally using land value capture, limiting grants, and pursuing, where possible, sensible borrowing and public-private partnerships for large infrastructure investments. And finally, and this is a point which the book doesn't much explore, but I would just leave here as a last comment, if you find it's difficult to get changes in the policies and the approaches towards urban and metropolitan finance, see whether you can use land use and infrastructure planning interventions, the whole now movement of green cities and climate change adapting cities and institutions, and the need to create globally competitive cities as arguments for also change and effectively change municipal and urban metropolitan financing and management, which are so crucial to actually make sure that metropolitan areas can be the centers of growth, the centers of modernization, the centers of competitiveness for developing countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Johannes. We have a few questions, so we could start. Please do not hesitate, do not be shy, pose your question. So we have a number of questions. The first one is from Jean-Baptiste from Madagascar. Is it possible to do, okay, it's about accessing private capital. Is it possible to do that without good legal and institutional framework?
The short answer is no, not easily and not likely on a successful and sustained basis, which is one of the reasons why private capital for infrastructure finance even in metropolitan areas in the less developed and poor countries is more difficult. However, I think over time it's not, there's no reason why one should not focus on this. And by helping to develop the legal infrastructure, but also very importantly by strengthening the metropolitan own financial capacity, access to markets through borrowing or through floating bonds is, from a long-term perspective, is something to aim for. But do realize that unless you are in tandem, you're also developing the local revenue capacity so that actually the cities can repay the loans or repay the bonds. Of course, this is not a good avenue. There are a number of countries that have run into problems with excessive urban metropolitan borrowing. Argentina is a good case, good example. And once you get a debt overhang for urban areas, for metropolitan governments, of course, you are in a serious problem. So it's not just legal framework and institutional framework; it's very much also the financing framework and the financial capacity, revenue mobilization capacity, debt service capacity that needs to be developed. Thank you very much, Madagascar.
We have another question from Shaina Nisa on donor collaboration. Donor collaboration may be needed to gauge the performance of the recipient countries so that sequential projects could be promoted. What do you think?
I think you're right on. That's exactly right. What we found that there were very few cases where donor cooperation, coordination in urban and metropolitan areas, projects, has been attempted. There was one case, I'm trying to remember now, in, I believe it was in Bangladesh, where this was pursued and with some success. But more generally, as I mentioned, the strategies that donors have put forward and then the implementation, unfortunately, in terms of systematic cooperation and coordination, falls, I feel, seriously short of where they should be. The point about building systematically on projects and successful particular interventions, by the way, doesn't only apply to cases of donor coordination and one donor handing off, say, to another donor, although that can be an important way of replicating successful interventions, scaling up successful interventions. It also applies to donors in their own engagement over time. which unfortunately has all too often not been systematic and sustained, or applies to handing off, as I mentioned, systematically successful projects and programs in a systematic way, meaning well prepared and fully owned by the local authorities, handing off successful interventions to local authorities in due course. So this has to be planned. This whole question of replication, of scaling up of successful intervention deserves a lot more attention in general, and specifically, as you mentioned, in terms of donor coordination.
Another question from Aneteo Jackson. One-off projects may not be the optimal if we hope to enjoy long-term benefits. Are there any lessons learned regarding project selection?
Well, we're continuing, I think, a very important part of the conversation here, and this is actually one of my favorite topics. This is scaling up. How do we take successful interventions and scale them up, replicate them, scale them up for scaled-up impact? Because if you look at donor-supported interventions, but not only those, but also what very often metropolitan governments or national governments are doing on the ground, it is much too often one-off kind of interventions with no systematic follow-up. Now, what does that systematic follow-up mean? First of all, you need to plan from the beginning for actually replication and scaling up if your intervention is successful. Secondly, you actually need to monitor and evaluate as you come along. Thirdly, you need to look for partners all along already the first step you take, the first project you do. And then at the end of this first project, you either need to continue as a donor to stay engaged, which is often would be, in my view, an appropriate solution, or if you disengage, which for various reasons you may have to, you have to be absolutely sure that you've prepared the ground to hand off either to some other donors or, as very often the case has to be, to actually local partners, governments or otherwise, can be NGOs even where appropriate, so that your initiative, the initiative that you have supported, is not falling flat and after a while is no longer in fact effective. So yes, I think this is very important, and actually by reviewing the lessons, and you can look a bit in this, we've discussed a little bit in the chapter on aid, the last chapter, we believe a lot more could be done systematically focusing on replication, success, and scaling up of successful interventions.
Another question from Eric Virgil. How can issues with value capture be solved when capturing the land value increments?
Now, this is, I'm glad you're coming back to this, because this is the whole issue of land value capture is one that is, I would say, still, if you wish, is still in the process of developing, and systematic approaches are still being developed, if you wish, globally. There are many different ways of doing this. I mentioned in passing the Colombian system of valorización, which is quite a well-developed, in Colombia, quite a well-developed system, and has been used, for example, in Bogota, in Medellin, I believe in Cali also, in the major cities, quite extensively to finance both major infrastructure investments, but by the way also improvements of neighborhood roads and drainage and so on. There, what is being done is that the cost of the project is distributed by a formula across the adjoining project properties, and basically are special assessments or special tax assessments are being imposed on the owners of these particular properties. This is a cost-driven solution. You don't try to estimate what is the value improvement, but you say, look, we wouldn't do this project if there wasn't at least as much improvement in benefit and value improvement as the costs. And we've looked at this in aggregate, but now we distribute the cost roughly in proportion to what we believe, for example, because of proximity to the road or whatever is being constructed, what the benefit would be. So it's basically a way of distributing costs. That is one approach that's being used, and used with quite some success at certain times, less success at other times in Colombia. Another example would be in some cases where subways are being constructed. And you are well aware when a subway is being constructed, the property value around particularly the stations, the metro stations, subway stations, tend to shoot up because they have, of course, important value from the access to the station. And here there's some cases where, both in developed industrial countries, where one then has tried to estimate the likely impact of, or monitored the impact of increased property values, and then taxed a certain proportion of this to finance at least a part of the metropolitan, of the metro, the subway construction. A third approach is the so-called land readjustment, which has been used in Korea, South Korea, quite extensively in the past. Where the municipal government basically, if you wish, expropriates certain areas of the fringe of the city, then improves the land by putting in roads, drainage, water supply, and so on, and then returns the larger fraction of the, what you might call expropriated land, back to the original owners in proportion to their original share of land that they owned, but retain a certain amount of the improved land, and both for public use, such as schools or hospitals, but also to sell for commercial use. And it's from the sale of this land, improved land, that part that's being retained, that you can actually then finance the improvement of the process of development. There are other mechanisms doing this. As you will note, very few of them actually rely on a precise estimate of the value improvement. So the fact that you may not be able to estimate precisely the value of the improvement doesn't have to be a showstopper. What does tend to be a showstopper very often actually is more political. Basically, people thinking, well, I own this land. The fact that the value improves, the fact that some investment in the neighborhood doesn't necessarily mean that I should pay for it. So it's more a sense of political or, in fact, individual rejection of the idea than a technical impossibility of land value capture to finance urban improvement. And one needs to, in one way or another, and very important would be outreach and communicating the reason for why one is doing it. That has to be a very important part of the process.
Thanks, Johannes. We have a couple more questions, but we need to keep track of time. We have basically 5 minutes for questions. One question from Miriam on what effects can financial aid have in the relations and economic health of municipalities within metros? And then there is another question on Africa. You mentioned that in one slide about Africa's performance, which is better than average. Would you please explain?
Okay, let me start with the latter one because I think it's perhaps easier to answer. This is based purely the relatively good performance assessment of African urban and metropolitan development projects is based on the evaluations by the World Bank's independent evaluation office or independent evaluation groups of urban metropolitan development projects. And they found that, and you may know that when these evaluation offices, when they evaluate projects, they tend to rank them, rate them, whether or not they are highly successful, moderately successful, moderately unsuccessful, and so on. They have a ranking, a systematic ranking. And when you look at the rating of urban projects, development projects in Africa, relative to ratings in the rest of the developing world, that the World Bank, where the World Bank has been active, you find that African projects do remarkably well. Now, why is this? Very difficult to say, frankly, and I have not seen a good analysis of this. It could be simply because the World Bank is paying more attention, in a sense, investing more effort in preparing these projects. It could be in the way the projects are selected, that they are actually less ambitious perhaps. I don't know. The answer is I don't know. However, I think the important conclusion from this is that as one thinks about supporting urban development in Africa, one should not use the excuse that, oh, well, you know, these projects can't be successfully implemented in African countries. That, from where we sit and what we've looked at and found by way of evidence, would not be a good reason. So we believe institutions like the World Bank should actually push more in terms of urban development, support for urban development in Africa, and we believe the track record to date has been one that is actually supporting such a move. The question, the first of the question, I think it was Miriam. If I understood correctly, you were sort of asking the question: Is international aid or external aid helpful to getting local municipal governments or metropolitan governments actually to be more effective in raising their own financial resources, building their management capacity? Again, there's no, I think, simple answer to this. If you look at the evaluations, again, take that as a basis for judgment. Yes, there is indeed evidence that international aid has been successful on balance in helping metropolitan areas build physical infrastructure, to some extent help develop capacity, management capacity, but it's been particularly in the financial area where, unfortunately, based on past record, the lasting impact of aid in terms of helping metropolitan areas and urban governments build their capacity to raise their own financing has been, unfortunately, so far less positive than we would have hoped, which is in part due to the fact, we believe, that when you look at the actual projects, relatively little attention has been paid to this set of issues, the financing and financial management capacity issues. And so part of the recommendation that we put forward is to say, pay more attention to these issues, because if you don't, the sustainability of urban projects, of your urban projects that you're supporting, is likely to be severely undermined, as the evidence actually shows.
Great. Thanks, Jonas. Maybe a very, very last question before we wrap up. Someone mentioned, and this is Dr. Manan Patel, who said, isn't it possible to employ a person from donors to help in planning, monitoring, and evaluation of donor funds to help, to facilitate the use of better use of these funds?
Yeah, if I understand the question correctly, Dr. Patel, you're sort of wondering whether some direct deployment of donor or municipal management capacity from, let's say, industrial countries and developing countries would be helpful. I think there are actually some examples, and I'm most familiar with that actually in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, where twinning between cities of Western Europe and Eastern and Central Europe has been quite successfully employed. This is a different model from the usual sort of putting consultants on the ground that are financed by donors. These are actual people who are in their own cities, municipal government officials, and they are, for a year or two or three, are put on the ground, so to speak, in developing countries, in the cities of developing countries. This has been, I think, more successful on balance than a simple getting a consultant to sit for a year or two in a particular city. So it's an option that's worth exploring. I don't know of any particular program that donors pursue, except that I believe the European Union may have supported this, as I mentioned earlier, for Western twinning of Western and Eastern European city personnel.
Thank you very much, Johannes. If I may, just I have worked extensively in Africa on municipal development projects, so I may add to what Johannes mentioned in terms of performance of Africa. Key points, very quickly. One is we were in it for the long haul. We basically worked extensively on a number of projects involving very strong ownership from the government, central government and local government, very heavily involved in project design, preparation, supervision of implementation, extensive supervision, and work with local counterparts. So long-haul government ownership, key issues. Second thing is we linked also revenue mobilization and capacity building with investments. There was a direct link between the two. And I think this is something that we need also to make sure to remind people is, yes, it's one thing to raise revenues or to attract capital, but it's another thing to think how you use those public funds. How do you better prioritize your investment? Are there good projects or wrong projects? The expenditure side of the story, I think, is very important to tell. Third, we had also very strong performance monitoring measures through some contractual arrangements. We had designed contractual municipal contracts between local government and central government, which were cloned in a number of countries, and that proved to be very effective, both in channeling funds to where they should be channeled, and to also helping local governments and central governments start this dialogue on policy reforms. So again, we have 2 minutes to wrap up, so thank you very much, Johannes, for a very exciting session. This is again closing the series on webinars, 14th webinar on the book Financing Metropolitan Governments in Developing Countries, edited by Johannes, Roy Ball, and Debbie Wetzel by the Lincoln Institute. I just wanted to mention that there will be new series of webinars. We will start in August 2014, and in the fall also, the World Bank has just completed a very large program, actually a publication called the Municipal Finance. It's a handbook for local governments. Many of the questions that were raised this morning will be actually drilled down and addressed through the 8 chapters of this book. We are looking at decentralization issues, transfer, performance grants. We are looking at issues of revenue management, expenditure management, public asset management, access to credit, yes, as we said today, but for which cities and for what investments. We will be looking also at performance measurement in order to achieve accountability and transparency of local governments. So again, this book is coming out. We'll have a book launch on June 19th. And it is also supported by a companion document, which is an e-learning course. The e-learning course is currently being delivered by the World Bank. Next dates will be October 27th through December 19th, 2014. Again, Johannes, thank you very much. Last words, and thank you for everybody also for their participation and great questions. Thank you.
No, thank you very much for everybody chiming in, coming in probably late at night for some of you, and I hope we can move forward to support effective urban development, metropolitan development around the globe. And thanks a lot again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.